On the afternoon of November 14, 1896, a police constable named Thomas Wright walked through the door of a boarding house on Rue de la Fontaine in the city of Lyon, France. He had been sent to investigate a complaint from a landlord in the neighboring building. The landlord had reported a foul smell coming from the property. The smell had persisted for weeks. Tenants in adjacent buildings had also complained. Some said the smell was worst at night. Others said it was constant. One tenant said it reminded her of rotting meat. Another said it made her ill. The landlord had written to the police 3 times. This was the 4th complaint. The constable had finally been dispatched. Thomas Wright was 28 years old. He had been a constable for 6 years. He had investigated disturbances, thefts, and assaults. He had never investigated a smell before. He thought it was beneath his duties. But orders were orders. He walked to the boarding house. It was a narrow 3-story building, squeezed between a bakery and a tailor's shop. The facade was grey. The paint was peeling. The windows on the upper floors were small and covered with heavy curtains. The front door was wooden and weather-worn. A small sign next to the door read, "Chambres à louer," rooms for rent. The constable knocked. He waited. He heard footsteps inside. The door opened. A woman answered. She was middle-aged, perhaps in her late 40s or early 50s. She was well dressed in a dark blue dress with a high collar. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was pale. Her expression was neutral. She looked at the constable without speaking. The constable introduced himself. He explained why he was there. The woman nodded slowly. She introduced herself as Madame Jean Weber. She said she ran the boarding house. She had owned it for 8 years. The constable explained the complaints about the smell. Madame Weber smiled slightly. She said there was no problem. She said perhaps a rat had died in the walls. She said perhaps there was an issue with the drains. She said she would have it investigated. She began to close the door. The constable stopped her. He said he needed to inspect the property. Madame Weber's smile faded. She said that would not be necessary. The constable said it was required. Madame Weber hesitated. She looked past the constable to the street. Then she stepped aside. The house was dimly lit. Heavy curtains covered the windows even though it was afternoon. The air inside was stale and thick. The constable noticed the smell immediately. It was faint here in the entrance hall but present. It was organic, unpleasant. Madame Weber closed the door behind him. She gestured to the front parlor. The constable entered. The room was furnished with old chairs and a sofa. The upholstery was faded. A small table held a kerosene lamp. The walls were bare except for a single painting of a landscape. The painting was crooked. Madame Weber did not offer him a seat, stood near the doorway with her hands folded in front of her. The constable asked how many rooms she rented. Madame Weber said 6. She said the house had 3 floors. The ground floor contained the parlor, a small dining room, and a kitchen. The second floor had 4 rooms for rent. The third floor had 2 more rooms. The constable asked how many guests were currently staying. Madame Weber said she was not certain. She said people came and went. She said some stayed for a few days, others stayed longer. The constable asked if she kept a register. Madame Weber said no. The constable said it was customary for boarding houses to keep records. Madame Weber said she preferred not to. She said her guests valued their privacy. She said many of them did not wish to be recorded. The constable made a note of this. He asked if he could inspect the rooms. Madame Weber said the guests valued their privacy. She said she could not disturb them. The constable said he was investigating a public health concern. He said it was within his authority to inspect. Madame Weber looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. She said she would show him the rooms. But she said some guests were not present. She said some rooms were empty. The constable said that was acceptable. Madame Weber led him through the narrow hallway to the stairs. They climbed to the second floor. The stairs creaked under their weight. The smell was stronger here. The constable covered his nose with his hand. Madame Weber seemed unaffected. She walked ahead of him down the corridor. She stopped at the first door. She knocked. No one answered. She opened it. The room was small, perhaps 3 meters by 4 meters. A narrow bed was pushed against one wall. A wooden chair sat near the window. A washstand with a cracked basin stood in the corner. The room was empty of personal belongings. The bed was made. The sheets looked old but clean. The constable asked where the guest was. Madame Weber said the guest had left 2 days ago. She said he had paid his rent and departed without notice. The constable asked if this was common. Madame Weber said yes. She said many guests left suddenly. She said they did not always say goodbye. She said they had their reasons. The constable moved to the next room. Madame Weber opened the door. This room was similar to the first, also empty, also clean. Madame Weber said this guest had left the previous week. The constable asked if she knew the guest's name. Madame Weber said she thought it was Pierre, or perhaps Paul. She said she was not certain. She said the man had not spoken much. He had kept to himself. The constable asked what the man had looked like. Madame Weber said he was of average height, average build. She said he wore a grey coat. She said she did not remember much else. The constable asked where the man had gone. Madame Weber said she did not know. She said guests did not share their plans with her. They continued down the corridor. The third room was occupied. Madame Weber knocked. A man's voice answered. Madame Weber opened the door slightly. She spoke through the gap. She said the police were conducting an inspection. She said it would only take a moment. The man inside grumbled, but agreed. The constable entered. The man was lying on the bed. He was perhaps 50 years old, unshaven. His clothes were dirty. He smelled of alcohol and sweat. The constable asked his name. The man said his name was Jacques. The constable asked his surname. The man said Dupont. The constable asked how long he had been staying at the boarding house. Jacques said 3 days, maybe 4. He was not certain. The constable asked if he had noticed any unusual smells. Jacques laughed. He said the whole place smelled. He said he did not care. He said the rent was cheap. The constable thanked him and left the room. The fourth room on the second floor was also empty. Madame Weber said this guest had left that morning. She said the guest was a woman. She said the woman had stayed for only 2 nights. The constable asked why the woman had left so quickly. Madame Weber said she did not know. She said perhaps the woman had found work elsewhere. She said perhaps the woman had decided to move on. The constable noted that all the empty rooms looked remarkably similar. They were all clean. They all lacked personal belongings. It was as if no one had ever stayed in them. They climbed to the 3rd floor. The stairs here were narrower. The ceiling was lower. The smell was much stronger. The constable felt his stomach turn. He asked Madame Weber if she noticed the smell. She said yes. She said it had been getting worse. She said she believed it was coming from the walls. She said there must be a dead animal somewhere. The constable said the smell seemed too strong for a rat. Madame Weber did not respond. On the 3rd floor, there were 2 doors. Both were closed. Madame Weber stopped in front of the first door. She said this room was not in use. The constable asked why. She said it needed repairs. She said the roof leaked. She said the room was not fit for guests. The constable asked to see it. Madame Weber said she did not have the key. She said the door had been locked for months. The constable said that was convenient. Madame Weber said nothing. He tried the door handle. It was locked. He moved to the second door. Madame Weber said this room was also closed. The constable asked why. She gave the same explanation. The constable said he found it suspicious that both rooms on the floor with the strongest smell were locked. Madame Weber said it was a coincidence. The constable said he did not believe in coincidences. He said he would return with authority to open the rooms. Madame Weber's expression hardened. She said that would not be necessary. She said she would have the rooms inspected herself. She said she would find the source of the smell. The constable said he would return in 2 days. He said if the rooms were not opened, he would bring a magistrate. Madame Weber said she understood. The constable left the boarding house. He walked back to the station. He filed a report. He described the house. He described Madame Weber. He described the locked rooms. He described the smell. He recommended immediate investigation. His superior read the report. He agreed. He said they would return with a magistrate. He said they would open those rooms. 3 days later, on November 17, 1896, Constable Wright returned to the boarding house. He was accompanied by another constable named Louis Bertrand and a magistrate named Henri Fournier. They knocked on the door. Madame Weber answered. Her expression showed no surprise. She had been expecting them. Magistrate Fournier introduced himself. He said they had authority to inspect the locked rooms. He presented the signed order. Madame Weber read it slowly. Then she nodded. She said she would cooperate. She led them inside and up the stairs. When they reached the third floor, Magistrate Fournier demanded the keys to the locked rooms. Madame Weber said the keys were downstairs. She went to retrieve them. The 3 men waited in the corridor. Constable Bertrand said the smell was overwhelming. He said he had worked in the city for 15 years. He said he had never smelled anything like this. Constable Wright agreed. Magistrate Fournier said nothing. He covered his nose with a handkerchief. Madame Weber returned with 2 keys. She handed them to the magistrate. He approached the first door. He inserted the key. The lock turned. He pushed the door open. The smell rushed out like a wave. All 3 men stepped back. Constable Bertrand gagged. Magistrate Fournier held his handkerchief tighter against his face. Constable Wright forced himself to look inside. The room was dark. The curtains were drawn. He could see the shape of a bed. He could see something on the floor in the corner. He told Madame Weber to open the curtains. She did not move. Constable Wright entered the room. He walked to the window. He pulled the curtains aside. Light flooded in. He turned. In the corner, beneath a pile of old blankets, he saw it. A hand. Gray. Decomposed. He pulled back the blankets. Beneath was a body. A man. Fully clothed. He had been dead for weeks, perhaps longer. The body was badly decomposed. The face was unrecognizable. Magistrate Fournier entered the room. He examined the body briefly. He said this was now a criminal investigation. He ordered Constable Bertrand to secure the premises. He ordered Constable Wright to open the second room. Constable Wright took the second key. His hands were shaking. He unlocked the door. The smell from this room was equally strong. He opened the door fully. He saw another bed, another body. This one was a woman. She was lying on the bed. She wore a simple dress. Her hands were folded across her chest. She had also been dead for weeks. The body was decomposed. The skin was discolored. Magistrate Fournier examined this body as well. He said they needed the medical examiner. He said they needed to search the entire house. He turned to Madame Weber. She was standing in the doorway. Her expression was blank. He asked her to explain the bodies. She said they were guests. She said they had died of illness. She said she had not known what to do. She said she had been afraid. Magistrate Fournier did not believe her. He placed her under arrest. Additional officers arrived within the hour. They sealed the boarding house. They began a systematic search. They started with the third floor. They examined the two rooms where the bodies had been found. They found no signs of a struggle. The rooms appeared orderly. The bodies had been placed deliberately, covered, arranged. This suggested the deaths had not been accidental. This suggested premeditation. They searched the second floor. They examined the four rooms. Three were empty. One was occupied by Jacques Dupont, who was questioned again. He said he had been staying at the boarding house for 4 days. He said he had not noticed anything unusual. He said he had not heard anything unusual. He said he kept to himself. He said he drank. He said he slept. He said he did not pay attention to other guests. The officers searched his room. They found nothing suspicious. Jacques was told he could not return to the boarding house. He was told to find other accommodations. He left without protest. The officers searched the ground floor. The kitchen was small and dirty. Dishes were piled in the sink. The stove was covered with grease. In the pantry, they found food supplies, bread, cheese, some preserved vegetables. Nothing unusual. In the dining room, they found a table and 4 chairs. The table was empty. In a drawer, they found cutlery and some papers. The papers were bills and receipts. Nothing related to guests. Then they searched the cellar. The entrance to the cellar was in the kitchen. A narrow door led to steep wooden stairs. The cellar was dark and damp. The officers brought lamps. They descended carefully. The cellar was larger than expected. It extended beneath most of the house. The ceiling was low. The floor was dirt. Along one wall were shelves holding old jars and bottles. Along another wall were stacks of wood and coal. In the far corner, they found something else. A pile of earth. The earth was darker than the surrounding floor. It looked as if it had been disturbed recently. One officer took a shovel from the corner of the cellar. He began to dig. Within minutes, he struck something hard. He brushed away the dirt. It was bone. A human bone. They dug carefully. Over the next several hours, they uncovered more remains. Bones, fragments of clothing, a shoe, part of a skull. The remains were not intact. They had been there for some time. The earth had partially absorbed them. The officers continued digging. They found evidence of at least 3 individuals buried in the cellar. Perhaps more. The remains were carefully extracted and placed in sacks. They would be taken to the medical examiner for analysis. In another area of the cellar, beneath a pile of old blankets, they found personal belongings, wallets. Some contained identity papers, others were empty, watches, several pocket watches, all of different makes, rings, wedding bands and simple bands, coins, a small amount of money. These items clearly belonged to different people. They did not belong to Madame Weber. The officers catalogued everything. They took it as evidence. By the end of the day, the search was complete. 2 bodies had been found in the locked rooms on the 3rd floor. Remains of at least 3 more individuals had been found in the cellar. Personal belongings of numerous people had been recovered. The evidence suggested that multiple people had died in the boarding house. The evidence suggested they had been killed. The evidence suggested Madame Weber was responsible. Madame Jean Weber was taken to the city jail. She was placed in a cell. She was questioned by investigators. The questioning began the following morning. An inspector named Claude Renard conducted the interrogation. He was experienced. He had investigated murders before. He began calmly. He asked Madame Weber to explain the bodies found in her house. She said they were guests who had died. She said they had been ill. She said they had died despite her care. Inspector Renard asked why she had not reported the deaths. She said she had been afraid. She said she thought people would blame her. She said she did not know what to do. She said she had hidden the bodies. Inspector Renard asked about the remains in the cellar. Madame Weber said those were older guests. She said they had died years ago. She said she had buried them because she could not afford proper burials. Inspector Renard asked why she had kept their belongings. She said she thought she might need to return them to their families. She said she had been waiting for someone to claim them. Inspector Renard did not believe her. He asked how many people had died in her boarding house. She said she did not remember. She said perhaps 5 or 6. Inspector Renard said they had found evidence of at least 7. He asked if there were more. She said she did not know. She said she had lost count. Inspector Renard changed his approach. He asked about specific individuals. He showed her a wallet that had been found in the cellar. The wallet contained identity papers for a man named Antoine Roche. The papers indicated he was 52 years old. He was from Toulouse. He had been a laborer. Inspector Renard asked if Madame Weber remembered this man. She said yes. She said he had stayed at her boarding house in 1894. She said he had stayed for about 2 weeks. Inspector Renard asked what had happened to him. She said he had become ill. She said he had a fever. She said he had died in his sleep. Inspector Renard asked if she had called a doctor. She said no. She said the man had no money for a doctor. Inspector Renard asked what she did with the body. She said she buried it in the cellar. Inspector Renard asked why she kept his wallet. She hesitated. Then she said she thought his family might want it. Inspector Renard showed her another item. A wedding ring. He asked if she knew who it belonged to. She said no. He said it had been found in the cellar. He said it suggested a married person had died in her house. He asked if she remembered any married guests. She said many guests wore rings. She said she did not remember them all. Inspector Renard pressed her. He said they had found multiple wedding rings. He said this suggested multiple married people had died. He asked her to explain. She said she could not. She said she did not remember. Inspector Renard then confronted her with the medical examiner's preliminary findings. He said the 2 bodies found in the locked rooms had not died of illness. He said one had been strangled. He said bruising was visible on the neck. He said the other had been struck on the head. He said the skull was fractured. He said these were not natural deaths. He said these were murders. He asked Madame Weber to explain. She said she did not know what he was talking about. She said the guests had been ill. She said they had died. She said she had not hurt them. Inspector Renard said the evidence contradicted her claims. He said the bodies had been hidden deliberately. He said the personal belongings had been taken. He said money had been stolen. He said this was theft. He said this was murder. He asked Madame Weber to confess. She refused. She said she had done nothing wrong. She said she had only tried to help her guests. She said she was a victim of circumstance. Inspector Renard ended the interrogation. He said they would continue the next day. The medical examiner completed his analysis of the bodies. His report was detailed. The first body, the man found in the first locked room, was estimated to have been dead for 4 to 6 weeks. The cause of death was determined to be manual strangulation. Bruising on the throat indicated sustained pressure. The victim's hyoid bone was fractured. This was consistent with strangulation. The victim was male, approximately 50 to 60 years old. He had been of average height and build. He had been wearing simple clothing, a laborer's clothes. His identity could not be determined from the body alone. The second body, The woman found in the second locked room was estimated to have been dead for approximately 6 to 8 weeks. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The skull showed a depressed fracture on the left side. The fracture was consistent with a heavy blow from a blunt object, perhaps a hammer or a club. The victim was female, approximately 35 to 45 years old. She had been of slight build. She had been wearing a simple dress. Her identity could also not be determined from the body alone. The remains found in the cellar were more difficult to analyze due to their condition. The medical examiner determined that they belonged to at least 3 individuals. One was male, approximately 60 to 70 years old. Another was male, approximately 40 to 50 years old. The third was female, approximately 25 to 35 years old. The cause of death for these individuals could not be determined due to the advanced state of decomposition. However, the manner in which they had been buried, quickly, without ceremony, in shallow graves, suggested foul play. Investigators began the process of identifying the victims. They reviewed missing persons reports from Lyon and surrounding areas. They found several potential matches. A man named Antoine Roche, age 52, had been reported missing in 1894. His description matched one set of remains found in the cellar. His family had filed a report when he failed to return home after traveling to Lyon for work. The wallet found in the cellar confirmed his identity. A woman named Simone Leclerc, age 38, had been reported missing in September 1896. She had been a seamstress. She had lost her job and had been looking for affordable accommodations. Her family had last heard from her in late August. She had sent a letter saying she had found a room at a boarding house on Rue de la Fontaine. She had not been heard from since. The description of the woman found in the second locked room matched Simone. Her family was contacted. They confirmed that the dress found on the body was one Simone had owned. Her identity was confirmed. A man named Louis Martin, age 61, had not been officially reported missing. But investigators found references to him in correspondence with the Veterans Organization. Louis had been a retired soldier. He had no family. He had been living at a boarding house in Lyon. The last record of him was from early 1896. The boarding house where he had been staying was Madame Weber's establishment. His description matched the older male remains found in the cellar. A ring found among the belongings in the cellar was later identified as belonging to him. His identity was confirmed. 4 other victims were never identified. The male body found in the first locked room remained unknown. The remains of 2 males and 1 female found in the cellar remained unknown. Their belongings offered no clear identification. Their descriptions did not match any missing persons reports. Investigators believed these victims had been transients, people with no fixed address, people with no family, people who moved from place to place and left no records, people who disappeared and no one noticed. The investigation expanded beyond the physical evidence. Investigators interviewed people who had known Madame Weber. They spoke to neighbors, they spoke to shopkeepers, they spoke to former guests who had survived their stay at the boarding house. A picture began to emerge. A baker named Henri Moreau, whose shop was next door to the boarding house, said he had known Madame Weber for years. He said she had purchased bread from him regularly. He said she was always polite but distant. He said she never made conversation beyond what was necessary. He said she had mentioned once that her business was difficult. He said she had said it was hard to make ends meet. He said she had said her guests often could not pay. He said she had seemed frustrated. Henri said he had noticed many people entering the boarding house over the years but few leaving. He said he had assumed they left early in the morning or late at night when his shop was closed. He said he had not thought much of it. He said after learning about the murders, he felt guilty. He said he wished he had paid more attention. A seamstress named Claire Dubois, who lived across the street, said she had seen Madame Weber leaving the house on several occasions carrying large bundles. She said the bundles appeared heavy. She said Madame Weber would load them onto a small cart and push the cart away. Claire said she had assumed Madame Weber was taking laundry to be cleaned or disposing of old furniture. She said Madame Weber would return an hour or two later. The cart would be empty. Claire said this happened several times a year. She said she had not questioned it. She said after the arrests, she wondered what had been in those bundles. She said she believed they had contained bodies or remains. She said she felt sick thinking about it. Another neighbor, a man named Francois Petit, said he had tried to speak to some of Madame Weber's guests. He said he had seen a man standing outside the boarding house one evening in the summer of 1895. The man looked unwell. He was thin. His clothes were ragged. Francois had asked if he was all right. The man said he was tired. He said he had been walking for days. He said he was staying at the boarding house. He said Madame Weber had given him a room and some soup. Francois said the man looked grateful. Francois said he offered to help the man find work. The man said he would appreciate that. Francois said he told the man to come by his shop the next day. The man said he would. Francois said the man never came. Francois said he went to the boarding house a few days later to ask about the man. Madame Weber said the man had left. She said he had moved on. Francois said he accepted this explanation. He said after the arrests, he realized the man had probably been killed. He said he felt terrible. He said he should have done more. A former guest named Paul Girard came forward after reading about the case in the newspapers. He said he had stayed at Madame Weber's boarding house in 1894. He said he had shared a room with another man. The other man was older, perhaps 60 years old. Paul said the man had been traveling from Marseille to Paris. He said the man was looking for work. He said the man had a small amount of money saved. Paul said he had seen the man show Madame Weber his wallet. He said the wallet had looked full. Paul said the next morning, the man was gone. Paul said he had asked Madame Weber where the man went. She said the man had left early. She said he had been in a hurry. She said he would return for his belongings. Paul said the man's coat and bag was still in the room. Paul said he thought it was strange. He said he mentioned this to Madame Weber. She said the man had said he would come back. Paul said the man never returned. Paul said a few days later, the man's belongings were gone. Paul said he asked Madame Weber what happened to them. She said she had stored them. Paul said he did not think much of it at the time. He said he stayed at the boarding house for another week and then moved on. He said after reading about the arrests, he realized the old man had probably been one of the victims. He said he felt guilty for not reporting it at the time. Investigators also spoke to a woman named Marguerite Blanc, who had known Jean Weber before she opened the boarding house. Marguerite said she had been friends with Jean in the 1880s. She said Jean had been married to a merchant named Philippe Weber. She said Philippe had owned a small shop selling fabric and clothing. She said the business had been successful. She said Jean had been content. She said after Philippe died in 1886, everything changed. Marguerite said Jean had inherited the shop but had not been able to run it. She said Jean had no business sense. She said the shop had failed within a year. Marguerite said Jean had become desperate. She said Jean had sold the shop and used the money to purchase the boarding house. Marguerite said she had visited Jean at the boarding house once in 1890. She said the house had been dark and cold. She said Jean had seemed different. She said John had been distant and cold. Marguerite said she had not felt welcome. She said she had not visited again. Marguerite said she had heard rumors over the years about strange happenings at the boarding house. She said people said guests disappeared. She said people said Madame Weber was dangerous. Marguerite said she had not believed the rumors. She said she had thought people were being superstitious. She said she wished she had believed them. She said she wished she had done something. Based on the testimony of witnesses and the evidence recovered from the boarding house, investigators developed a theory about Madame Weber's crimes. They believed she had been killing her guests for approximately 8 years, from 1888 to 1896. They believed she had targeted vulnerable people. People who were alone. People who were poor. People who had no family. People who would not be missed. They believed she had chosen her victims carefully. She would assess each guest. She would determine if they had money. She would determine if they had connections. If they had neither, they became targets. The method varied. Some victims appeared to have been strangled. Others had been struck on the head. Investigators believed Madame Weber had killed her victims while they slept or when they were incapacitated. She may have drugged them. She may have offered them food or drink laced with sedatives. Once they were unconscious, she would kill them. She would take their belongings. She would search their pockets and bags. She would take any money, jewelry, or items of value. Then she would dispose of the bodies. Some she hid in the locked rooms on the 3rd floor. Others she buried in the cellar. Some investigators believed she may have transported away from the boarding house in the bundles witnesses had seen her carrying. Investigators estimated that at least 20 people had stayed at the boarding house and were never seen again. They reviewed missing persons reports. They interviewed people in Lyon. They found references to individuals who had been looking for accommodations and had been directed to Madame Weber's boarding house. These people had not been heard from again, but many had not been officially reported missing. They had no family to report them. They had no friends to notice their absence. They had simply disappeared. The trial of John Weber began on April 5, 1897, in the Lyon courthouse. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The courtroom was packed every day. Journalists from across France attended. The case had captured national attention. People were horrified. They were fascinated. They wanted to understand how a seemingly ordinary woman could commit such crimes. The prosecution was led by a prosecutor named Edouard Mercier. He was known for his thoroughness. He presented a methodical case. He called 43 witnesses. He presented hundreds of pieces of evidence. He showed the jury photographs of the boarding house. He showed them photographs of the bodies. He showed them the personal belongings recovered from the cellar. He showed them the wallets, the watches, the rings. He showed them identity papers belonging to the victims. He showed them the evidence of murder. He called the medical examiner who testified about the causes of death. He explained the strangulation. He explained the blunt force trauma. He explained that these were not natural deaths. He explained that these were homicides. He called neighbors who testified about Madame Weber's behavior. They described her carrying bundles away from the house. They described guests entering and never leaving. They described the smell that had persisted for years. They described their suspicions. He called former guests who had survived. Paul Girard testified about the old man who had disappeared. He described showing Madame Weber his wallet. He described the man's belongings being left behind. He described how they had eventually disappeared. He said he believed Madame Weber had killed the man and stolen his money. Other former guests testified about the atmosphere in the boarding house, They described feeling watched. They described feeling unsafe. They described leaving as soon as they could afford to. The prosecutor argued that Madame Jean Weber had systematically murdered her guests over a period of 8 years. He argued that she had targeted vulnerable people. He argued that she had killed them for money. He argued that she had stolen their belongings and disposed of their bodies. He argued that she had shown no remorse. He argued that she had continued killing for years without being caught. He argued that only luck, the persistence of the smell, and the complaints of neighbors had stopped her. He argued that she was a cold, calculating killer. He argued that she deserved the death penalty. The defense was led by a lawyer named Antoine Roussel. He faced an impossible task. The evidence against his client was overwhelming, but he did what he could. He argued that the prosecution had not proven how all the victims died. He argued that some may have died of natural causes. He argued that Madame Weber had panicked and hidden the bodies out of fear. He argued that she was a widow who had fallen on hard times. He argued that she had made poor decisions but was not a murderer. He called character witnesses. A few people who had known Jean Weber before the boarding house testified that she had been kind. They said she had been a good wife. They said she had been generous. They said the woman they knew could not have done these things. But under cross-examination, these witnesses admitted they had not seen Jean in years. They admitted they did not know what she had become. The defense argued that there was reasonable doubt. They argued that the prosecution had not proven Madame Weber had killed all 7 victims. They argued that some of the remains in the cellar were too decomposed to determine cause of death. They argued that the prosecution was relying on circumstantial evidence. They argued that Madame Weber deserved mercy. But their arguments were weak. The evidence was too strong. The testimony was too damning. Jean Weber did not testify in her own defense. Her lawyer advised against it. He said she would not be a sympathetic witness. He said the jury would not believe her. Jean agreed. She sat silently throughout the trial. She showed no emotion. She did not react when witnesses described the horrors found in her boarding house. She did not react when the prosecutor called her a monster. She simply stared straight ahead. Some observers said she looked bored. Others said she looked resigned. A journalist who attended the trial wrote that Jean Weber seemed disconnected from reality. He wrote that she seemed to exist in a world of her own making where her crimes were justified or forgotten. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On April 28, 1897, they returned their verdict. Guilty on all 7 counts of murder. The judge asked Jean Weber if she had anything to say. She stood. She looked at the judge. She said she had done what was necessary. She said her guests had nowhere else to go. She said she had given them shelter. She said some had died. She said it was not her fault. She said the world had failed them, not her. The judge asked if she was confessing to the murders. She said she had done what she had to do. The judge asked her to clarify. She said nothing more. She sat down. The judge pronounced sentence. Death by guillotine. Jean Weber showed no reaction. Her lawyer said he would appeal, but Jean said no. She said she did not want to appeal. She said she was ready to accept her fate. Her lawyer tried to convince her. She refused. She said there was no point. She said the outcome would be the same. She was taken back to prison. Jean Weber was executed on July 15, 1897, at 6 o'clock in the morning. The execution took place in the courtyard of the Lyon prison. A small crowd of officials and journalists attended. Jean was led to the scaffold. She walked calmly. She did not speak. She did not pray. The executioner positioned her beneath the blade. He asked if she had any final words. She said no. The blade fell. She was pronounced dead immediately. Her body was taken away. It was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery. No family members claimed her. No one attended her burial. No priest said prayers. She was buried without ceremony. She was forgotten. The boarding house on Rue de la Fontaine was torn down in the autumn of 1897. The city ordered its demolition. No one wanted to preserve a place where such horrors had occurred. The demolition took 2 weeks. Everything was destroyed. The walls, the floors, the stairs, the rooms where people had died, all of it was reduced to rubble. The rubble was carted away, the lot was cleared, the property was sold to a developer. A small apartment building was constructed on the site. The building was completed in 1899. It still stands today. Most residents are unaware of what came before. Those who know prefer not to speak of it. There is no plaque, no memorial, nothing to indicate what happened there. The 7 confirmed victims were buried in a communal grave in the Lyon Municipal Cemetery. The grave is located in the paupers section. A small stone marker was placed at the site. The marker reads, "In memory of the victims of Rue de la Fontaine, 1888-1896. Below that, 3 names are listed: Antoine Roche, Simone Leclerc, Louis Matin. Below that, it says, "And 4 unknown souls, may they rest in peace." The grave is rarely visited. Occasionally, someone places flowers there. Historians, true crime enthusiasts, people who remember. But most days, the grave sits empty and forgotten. In the years following the execution, the case of John Weber was studied by criminologists and sociologists. They wanted to understand how such crimes could continue for so long without detection. They concluded that several factors had contributed. First, Madame Weber had deliberately targeted vulnerable people. People without family, people without connections, people who would not be missed. Second, she had operated in a time and place where regulations were lax. Boarding houses were not required to keep registers. Deaths did not have to be reported. People could disappear without consequence. Third, she had been patient. She had not killed frequently. She had spaced out her crimes. This had prevented a pattern from being noticed. Fourth, she had been careful. She had hidden the bodies. She had disposed of evidence. She had maintained the appearance of normalcy. And finally, people had not wanted to see. Neighbors had noticed strange things but had dismissed them. They had not wanted to believe that something evil was happening next door. They had not wanted to get involved. The case led to reforms. In 1898, the Lyon City Council passed new ordinances requiring all boarding houses to maintain registers of guests. The registers had to include names, dates of arrival, and dates of departure. Landlords were required to report any deaths that occurred on their properties. Failure to comply resulted in fines and potential closure of the establishment. These regulations were eventually adopted by other cities across France and throughout Europe. They were a direct response to the horrors of Rue de la Fontaine. But the regulations came too late for the victims. They had already disappeared. They had already died. They had already been forgotten. And many questions remained unanswered. How many people had actually died in that boarding house? The confirmed count was 7. But investigators believed there were more. They believed at least 20 people had disappeared from the boarding house between 1888 and 1896. Perhaps more. The true number would never be known. Many victims had left no trace. Many had no one to report them missing. They had simply vanished, and John Weber had taken the full count to her grave. The case of the Rue de la Fontaine boarding house remains one of the most disturbing in French criminal history. It is a reminder of how vulnerable some people are, how easily they can be exploited, how easily they can disappear. It is a reminder that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it operates quietly, behind closed doors, in places that seem ordinary. Sometimes it targets the people society has already forgotten, and sometimes it continues for years before anyone notices. That is the true horror of this case. Not just the violence, not just the deaths, but the invisibility of the victims. The fact that they lived and died in anonymity. The fact that no one cared enough to notice they were gone. That is what haunts us. That is what we must remember. Because there are still people living on the margins, people with no fixed address, people with no family, people who could disappear and no one would notice. We must see them. We must count them. We must ensure they are not forgotten. That is the lesson of Rue de la Fontaine. That is the legacy of Jean Weber's victims. They were invisible in life. They must not be invisible in death. We must remember them. We must say their names. Antoine Roche, Simone Leclerc, Louis Martin, and the four whose names we do not know, and the others who were never found. We remember them. We honor them. We ensure they are not forgotten. That is what we owe them. That is what we owe all victims. To see them, to remember them, to ensure that no one disappears without someone noticing, without someone caring. That is justice. That is memory. That is humanity.